the plan comes out of the intention, right? And when the plan starts failing, you come back to the intention, and I think this is something that we've talked about a lot on the podcast before, and something that I always forget about and I always need to remind myself about, but is the power of intention. It's very, very powerful. Like I think of intention as being like a flow of water, right? Like it's cutting and carving through places. It's finding the way through, but it's not forcing itself down a place where it can't go, but it finds the path that is there for it.
This is Way of the Artist with Brandon Colby Cook and Evan Schulte.
Exploring the challenges of the creative call
so that you can claim your own path
and make your life a work of art. All right. Third time's a charm, hopefully. Hey everybody, welcome to Way of the Artist, and we're jumping into a conversation here, not knowing exactly what we're talking about on this one, but I'm coming in with maybe something to open things up, and this is the third time because we've been having some technical issues, this is the third time I'm like kind of try to set the stage here. So I was having some conversations with some other acting teachers who I've worked with in the past, and I've met somebody who I never met before who, loads of experience and training and all of that kind of stuff. And it was really fascinating to me to have this conversation because this person, the kind of training that they do, like the specifics of what they do in terms of how they work with actors is very different from what I do with like teaching Meisner and things like that. But underneath the thing that we each do is the same thing. Like we were both very much in this space of talking about art and creativity as being this thing that happens to you, right? And trying to take students, right, to that place where they have that experience, right? Where they have that experience of like, oh, holy shit, this is something that's kind of doing me, right? Like I'm not exactly steering this ship in a kind of way. But there's something that's happening. And, it's very much a way in which I view sort of art and the process of art, which is, it's kind of, art is kind of a seeking of sorts. And I see like art as being like the experience and expression of the creative or the creative energy or creation working through you and as you and to you, right? It's kind of hitting you in all of these different levels, right? And so like your craft is really about how do you set the stage for that to occur? How do you give yourself the best opportunity for that thing to happen? Because it's a spontaneous thing, right? Like that's one thing that it took me a long time to learn that as an artist. It's like, no, it's not a premeditated thing. Like real creativity and art doesn't happen in a premeditated way. It's a spontaneous action. But that doesn't mean that it's just all by chance, right? Like there's training that you can do. There are processes in which kind of help us get into that territory. It helps you to get into that field where you're like, oh shit, all right. Like I kind of get what's happening here. But anyhow, so that was like kind of what me and this teacher were talking about, but we just had different ways of going about it. So I mean, this is a person who I'm definitely gonna connect with again because I'm super interested in learning more about what the things they do, and they're interested in learning more about some of the things that I do, because it's like, hey, if we can incorporate some of each other's knowledge into how we work with others, and just to help others get into that kind of space, right? But anyhow, that was just, I don't know where we go from there, but that was just something that I've been thinking about coming into this one.
Well, something that I've been working through recently has been the idea of having a plan and an intention. So it kind of relates to that, where it's like one thing I've noticed recently, and I've been dealing with this a lot, is that my plans keep going to shit. I'm like, okay, what's the point of even making a plan? Like, things just keep kind of going in this unexpected way. And this is happening and happening and happening. And then I was like, well, like, I still believe in making a plan. I still think it's good to figure out what I'm going to do. But I realized, I'm like, I need to change the way I look at this. It needs to be about what's my intention as opposed to what's my plan. And I was thinking as you were talking, I'm like, art is a lot like that. It's like, you have this scene that you're maybe acting in, for example, because we're talking about acting, and you have this intention. And you go, this is what I'm going to do, and this is how I'm going to go about it, and whatever. And then all of a sudden, stuff doesn't go as you plan. And that's where you got to go back to your intention and be like, hey, well, this is what I'm trying to do, but it's not going to plan. And so now I need to adapt. I need to pivot. I need to approach this differently. And all of a sudden, you find yourself in territory you didn't even expect to be in. And sometimes you're in this unknown, and you're like, the plan is so far away from what it was when you started. Like that you can't even figure out how to get back to it. It's almost like dead. And you're like, okay, that's over. And you have to, and there's this moment, like you can be in the middle of a scene while you're acting. And this actually happens in writing too. And you just have to detach. You have to detach from the plan and let go of it entirely and just like abandon it. And then embrace this whole new thing, which is like, hey, this is where I am. And like, I'll give an example, just a life example. And I mean, maybe people can relate to this, but I was going to buy another motorcycle this last month. I even put an offer on it. I even talked the seller down. I got a good price. It was already a good price. I got a better price. They were going to pick me up because I had to go to the island to go get it. They were going to pick me up, drive me over. We worked it all out. We had the days scheduled. Everything was good. And then just things in my life were falling through in a way that I was just like, shit, I'm not going to be able to do this. It just isn't going to work. And sure enough, another buyer came along and they're like, well, there's someone else interested in the bike. I'm like, okay, here's my situation. If you have to sell it, you got to sell it. And I was just like, okay, whatever. And then things fell through and then the bike got sold and I'm like, fuck I wanted this motorcycle. And it was like my plan. It was literally like, and this is the thing, you do this work, you visualize and you imagine and you pray and you do all the stuff that you do. And then all of a sudden, the thing that you were dreaming of, it like manifests before you and you're like, it's here, it's happening. And then it's hard to express the amount of disappointment that happens. Like literally having it's people, whatever, it's just a motorcycle. It's not just a motorcycle. It's the motorcycle I wanted. The kilometers on it were the miles for the Americans. They were so low and it was pristine and it was the year I wanted. It was the color I wanted. It had the wheels I wanted. It had extras on it that I needed for what I was going to do. And the bike it's not even about the bike. It's about my greater purpose of the vision of where the bike was going to take me and like the trips I want to do. And all of a sudden, when it started to fall apart, all of this stuff around it started to fall apart too. And it put me into, which is a dramatic way of saying it, but like an existential crisis to a certain degree. I'm like, well, all my fears and doubts started coming up. Like the things you want, they're not really ever going to work out. And you're kind of foolish to dream and you're foolish to do this and, whatever. And, and then I had to combat with all that and just deal with that. And here's the thing. I just went back to, I'm like, well, what's the intention here? The intention is the motorcycle. It's not even about the motorcycle. It's about the motorcycle adventure. And although I think this is the bike that's going to take me on the adventure, clearly, based on the way things are working, it is not the one. And I was so attached. And so I had to kind of detach from it because this plan is falling apart. This whole thing that I thought is falling apart. The way I think it's going to happen is falling apart. But what's the intention? The intention is to begin to go on motorcycle adventures. So if it's not this bike, it's obviously another bike. And this becomes like, once you hit that point of acceptance, all of a sudden things shift again. And it's like, well, wait a minute. And then I was starting to look at it and I was like, well, there's some other motorcycles that have been kind of interesting me. And let me look into that a little bit more. And, maybe the timing's a little bit off. And like, let's kind of really consider what's going on in my life right now. And And yeah, you can say, well, you're just justifying, you're like, whatever. But it's like, this is what happens though in life. And this is the art of life. Sometimes things like the plan dies on the vine and there is no going back to the plan that you initially had. And you have to just let go of it. And I think what's really interesting about this conversation and that topic is that the moment the plan dies, you're immediately in the moment all over again. And I think you kind of like, the plan gets you out of the moment sometimes. Because they go, oh, okay, all this is happening. And you're thinking 10 steps ahead all of a sudden because you're starting to think this is going to work. And the disappointment is those 10 steps that I was already planning on ahead of time, now all of a sudden they're irrelevant and they're not going to work. And that's kind of disappointing. But the thing is that I think like Way of the Artist is about, yeah, sometimes that's going to happen and you need to come back to the moment for some reason because maybe you started taking steps beyond a moment that wasn't the right moment. And I'll say one other thing about this whole motorcycle. It's like, yeah, okay, to me, it was the perfect bike. I thought it was the perfect bike because I was exactly the bike I want. But, it was a used bike. Everything looked good. Seller looked good. But maybe I'm going to find out that the bike has problems. Maybe I'm going to find out that the size or the style or design of that bike is not actually the bike I wanted.Maybe I want a more powerful bike, a bigger bike, whatever. The thing is that I only know what I know. And right now, based on what I think I know what the best thing is to do. But if you would have talked to me a year ago about what motorcycle I would buy, I would have probably chosen a different bike. Because back then, I thought I knew what I knew. And I learned a bunch of things since then. And so then I chose this bike. So theoretically, when I do get the next bike that I get, I'm going to be in a different place than I am now. And it might be the same bike, but it also might not be. But there's things that I'm still acquiring on the journey. And so I think this interesting thing about what you're talking about is, yeah, like whatever our approach, however we go about it, it all does come back to the moment because it's the only thing that's real. I know it doesn't always feel that way, but this is something I've learned. And to reiterate my point, I've learned that you make a plan with an intention, willing to abandon the plan, but going back and keeping in touch with the intention.
Bringing a lot of very interesting things to bring, as you often do, Brandon. That's why I keep showing up for these conversations. Because I think the thing is with creativity and creation, the creative process, is that it takes on a life of its own, right? And that's something that you have to account for because it's like that's something that has a life of its own means it's going to surprise you. It's going to do things you didn't expect it to do, right? Which means you have to show up with that presence, with that responding to the moment, that willingness to abandon the idea that you've become attached to in your head, and not just and in a way learn to not begrudgingly do that, but learn to actually really embrace that. This is my acting teacher, one of my acting teachers used to say, is that like your partner can take you way further than you could ever dream of, right? Like and from an acting context where it's like, yeah, it's like you're doing this scene with this other person, sometimes multiple people, but we'll just keep it simple, like 2 people, yeah. Right? And by being responsive to that life, right, to that creative force that's there next to you, right, or across from you, things are going to happen that are out of your control, that you did not expect, that if you are responsive and sensitive to that thing, it's going to do incredible things for you, right? Because there's because that planning thing, that capacity that we have, which is a great thing, but again, it has its limits. As I talk a lot about, the limits of our intellects, which we put probably most of our time and energy into. Like we put the most amount of our personal stock into the intellect. And it's like, hey, it's a great thing and it needs to come along for the ride here, but it's not everything. Like there's so many things that it can't do, especially when it comes to creativity, because the intellect only knows what's past, right? The intellect can only do things that are contrived, right? Like that's the only thing that it's capable of doing when it comes to quote unquote creativity. And you could argue that that's not real creativity, right? Because that's when we start to say that, like, well, that's so derivative, right? Like it's this movie is just a copy and paste of better movies that came before it, right? And we, and we'll rake something over the coals for that, right? Because we're just like, where's the originality, right? And so, well, yeah, it's because it was done from an intellectual place, right? Well, let's just take this because that worked in this, and take this because that, like, look, hey, borrowing and taking inspiration from things, that's a different thing, right? Because it still has to lead to something new, something spontaneous, something that you find in that moment. The thing's got to take on, again, that life of its own, where you're just like, holy shit, where is this going? Right? Like you need to have that, to me, in the creative process. Like that's got to be coming up as much as you can manage to make that happen, right? Where it's like, holy shit, I don't know where this thing is going to go. I don't know the direction this thing is going to take. Because that's when the real kind of creative genius is showing up, right? But it doesn't come from that intellectual place. It's coming from elsewhere. I don't want to say what it is, but I know that it is, right? Like I know that it is a thing, that there is a thing that's coming from somewhere that's not from, from our heads. That's not from just the intellectual place that we most often work from. There is something there, right? So it's, and also I want to touch on what you're talking about with intention, because I think that is, in so many ways, it's a better way of viewing the plan. Like I think a plan and intention they're different things, but it's like the plan comes out of the intention, right? And when the plan starts failing, you come back to the intention, and I think this is something that we've talked about a lot on the podcast before, and something that I always forget about and I always need to remind myself about, but is the power of intention. It's very, very powerful. Like I think of intention as being like a flow of water, right? Like it's cutting and carving through places. It's finding the way through, but it's not forcing itself down a place where it can't go, right. But it finds the path that is there for it. Yeah. Right? It's not trying to make something happen that it is just not possible, but it's still so powerful, and it still finds its way down to the ocean. Like it has that flexibility, it has that adaptability. But yeah, it'll get you there, but it's not trying to, it doesn't have any attachment to it being a certain way, right? But that's kind of what an intention is to me. It's like, it's the effectiveness of it is that it can adapt and it can move and it can, but it's always still going in the right direction. Yeah.
Well, I was thinking of rigidity. It's not rigid. It's the flow, right? And we've talked about this. Getting into the flow creatively, and the flow, I think, people love to talk about this, especially artists, like, oh, I was in the zone, I was in the flow or whatever. And the flow is, it feels good because you're letting it go where it needs to go. You're not like making it try to go somewhere that it shouldn't go. And when you just like embrace that and trust it, and you kind of allow it to take you wherever it takes you, it feels so good because you find that wherever it takes you is the right place ultimately. And, and I think like, it's there. The flow is interesting, right? Because like initial creativity, like speaking as a writer, your initial flow of an idea can be extremely cliche and derivative. As you said, it can be shit. And often is actually, it's not uncommon that your initial ideas are actually not great ideas. They're usually, some of them are good, some of them are not. And it's this process of why editing is so important is you kind of weed out things. So I wrote this script, right? And, I just, this is back in the day, this is years ago. This is when things started to really happen for me as a writer. And, it was an interesting thing because I had this story idea, and I had this idea of like an undercover cop who just was never home and didn't get to see his wife and family. And, I look back at my notes, and my initial notes, like, because I would ask myself, well, why do you want to write this story? And so I wrote this thing on like why I wanted to write this story. And I remember walking around the streets of Vancouver, just pondering and thinking about this story. And I wanted to write this story because I thought the home life of an undercover cop who is like deep in an investigation is an interesting thing to explore. And so that's where the story started from. And then it became more about the undercover cop stuff and, whatever movies are about and whatever. And then we had some producers. So whatever, the script was okay, I suppose, good enough at least to get some attention. And then I had these producers who were going to they were like, hey, we want an undercover cop story. We're interested in this, whatever. So I had 3 weeks to do. I said, okay, well, I have some ideas. These are some things I was thinking of rewriting. They gave me 3 weeks. I sat down. I literally erased the script that I wrote. Like I started again. Same characters mostly. And it became very exciting. It was like action-y. It was better. I had read some books on undercover cops. I had read novels and things like that. I'm like, wow, I didn't know anything. And then it got really deep into this undercover cop story and changed a lot. And I remember we did this table read. So we did this table read, and I got all these actors to come in from Vancouver, and people read for different parts, and they recorded the table read, and then it got sent off to the producers and all of this stuff. And one of the actors came to me afterwards and he said, this movie, like it has like this one scene seems like it's from The Departed, because I love The Departed. And he was right. I mean, it was really like a scene from The Departed. It's like I almost just lifted that. And I was like, shit, that's obvious, right? And it was just evident to me. And then he was like, well, why did you write this movie? And I told him about the husband and wife and how they weren't seeing each other and and he's like, that sounds like an interesting story. He's like, why don't you write that story? He's like, that sounds like a good movie. And so it's interesting because that movie has been this very interesting journey for me where the intention got lost. And as the more it got lost, the more off the rails the movie ultimately went. And the movie never ended up getting made. And it was very disappointing to some degree, but also in some ways it was a blessing because I learned that my craftiness was actually working against me. And you pointed something out actually to me when you read the script. I don't remember which version of it you read, but I remember you saying that, you basically alluded to that there were some cliches in it, and there definitely was. And you said, why don't you look at all these cliches and just kind of make them your own? Like just say the idea in your own way. That changed the fucking game for me. That was one of the best bits of feedback I've ever gotten ever on writing, because there's a lot of ideas that in the flow, you're going to come up with the cliche, but the edit is a great way to say, well, you know, I still believe this. I still think this idea. Like a cliche might be like, birds of a feather flock together, just as an idea, right? But you might have a way of expressing that or showing that no one's ever seen it, or a way that you experienced it. And all of a sudden, this very cliche, common, overstated idea becomes brand new for everybody again. And they go, yeah, there's truth to that. And then it has an originality to it. So going with the flow isn't, I'm going to say, the ultimate answer, but it's the start. And without it, you won't get to the ultimate answer. And the plan is what you think the ultimate answer is. And the flow sometimes contradicts the plan. The flow will lead you to the ultimate plan, but just because you're in flow doesn't mean that you're always doing everything perfectly and right. It just means you're doing it the way it needs to go now until you come back to it and revise and rework it. So you have to, like, for example, as a writer, you have a scene, you have this idea, just write the scene. I've worked with so many writers, I've met so many writers, and like people often ask me, well, Brandon, how did you do this? How, like, you know, and the thing is the thing that I would tell you, the thing that has made the biggest difference and has got me in the door and opened up opportunities for me, not to say that I have the most illustrious writing career in the world, because I definitely don't, but the thing that has actually gotten me bites and interests and looks is that I'm willing to go back and rework an idea. But when I create an idea, I really try, even if it's cliche, I really just tried to do it as truthfully as I could in that moment. And sometimes my ideas, which I think are original, are actually very cliche, but there's something genuine about just writing from the heart, even though it's just shit that you saw in another movie and someone else told you would be cool and blah, 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 blah. And all your ideas seem like shit when you look upon them in review, but there's something authentic about it. And one thing that has happened in every single script that I've written pretty much, especially since then, I've never not had a reader point out this moment was fucking something. Because there's always these moments that sneak in, and you might just get a few little nuggets in your script. But I remember in the Burning Blues, that was the script, I remember one of my literaries was like, this scene, that is inspired. And I remember going, okay, what about this scene is true? Because like, okay, I wrote a whole movie and one scene is fucking inspired. Okay. That's somewhere to start from. That's somewhere to work from. It took me like 100+ pages to write an inspired scene. Okay, how do I make every scene an inspired scene? And, you know, and I think when you're working at your art, I think we all want to write a masterpiece. We all want to act a perfect performance. We all want to do the perfect painting. But like maybe there's one little thing you can look at in your work that while you were in flow, you found some element of real, true, authentic inspiration in it. And you can use that as kind of a starting point, and you can build upon that. But if you just come at it with ideas of like, hey, this is what makes a good script, and these are the techniques, and these are the tricks that I'm going to do, I think you're going to, not only going to write a cliched piece of garbage ultimately, but you're going to lose the opportunity of finding that 1, 2, or 3 authentic moments in your creativity, which are really what I think you build everything upon.
Oh man, you said so many good things there. Yeah, I mean, it's coming back somewhat to that like intention thing, you know, like that's sort of the intention of every artist, right? Like the intention is always to try and tell the truth, like say something honest and truthful about whatever it is that you're doing, like, and from the outset, right? Even knowing that, like, yeah, there's going to be some shit that ends up coming out here too, but there's still that, you know, I said earlier, it's like art and creativity is it's a seeking, right? You're trying to find something. There's some, and you don't always know what that is, but like there's enough to get you going into it, right? And then you kind of end up finding out what this thing's about, or at least hopefully you find out what this thing's actually about when you get into it. Like outside of your ideas of what the thing is, when you go into it, it's about finding what the actual thing is. Because in a way, you can almost assume that you actually don't really know what it is from the beginning, right? Like you know bits, like maybe some bits and pieces, maybe some important ones, but you don't really know yet. And it's interesting what you're saying about that one scene that you had in there in your script, because you can draw so much even just from, that one scene, that one monologue, that one line. I know for me, just like as an actor, part of it wasn't even necessarily something that I was consciously and still consciously am like looking to do. But when I'm reading a script and I'm going into a role, there's very often there's a line. There's something that the character says that it just, for whatever reason, I'm just like, this is so important. This thing that they just said here, for me at least, maybe not as much for another actor, but I'm like, this is telling me everything right now. This little thing that they just said to this other person is a key of some sort, right? And that doesn't make the rest of it less, but it actually just adds shades and nuance and understanding to everything else too, right? And so those are these honest little moments that are often like, they're these little keys to opening the whole thing up that can help inform everything else that comes with it, right? And it's like you've mentioned that a few times about like the whole cliche thing. And I don't know if that was something that I had seen or read or heard somewhere. Like I almost feel like it was something that when I first started flirting with doing writing and stuff and writing some of my own screenplays and stuff, that on coming back through and doing edits, it was something like there was like an irritation that I had whenever I saw something that I wrote that I was just like, I've seen this before. I've seen this scene before. And I'm bothered by the fact that like there's just that it's just something that doesn't have a voice in it to a certain extent. And so it was just a process of like, okay, well, the scene is still important. The information that's in it, or some of the things that are there for the plot, these are all still very important, right? Like I'm not looking to necessarily always change the function of it, but it's the way in which it's being done that I'm like, okay, well, let's just really sink into this scene. Let's really sink into it and really let me imagine these characters. Let me imagine these people in this place and what's going on with them. And let me just try and just peer into this conversation, into this moment and just just see what they're saying to each other and what they're doing, right? Let me just try and do that instead of me trying to control this thing, but instead allow the thing to have that life of its own. Allow these characters to have a life of their own so that I can just kind of be a fly on the wall and discover what's going on, right? And that's when I started to find it's like, oh, these scenes are now like they're rewriting themselves because I'm now just seeing it. I'm now just able to be a witness to these things that I'm not trying to force them to go into any direction necessarily, right? Like I know to a certain extent some things that have to happen here, but I don't know exactly the way in which that's going to happen. And like I love that you brought in the word flow, because it's like, yeah, it's for the water thing. It's like, yeah, like we talk about, like we call it creative flow. Water, liquid, like it's moving and it's dynamic, right? And like with something like a novel or a screenplay or something like that, it's like there it is, it's heading, like there's this flow and there's this river or this creek and it's heading down towards the ocean, and instead of, it's like when we are so rigid with our ideas and our preconceived notions and things with it, it's like it's like you're just trying to like tunnel a pipe directly down to the water, and it's like, okay, like, I guess it gets the job done, or think of that. Yeah, it's efficient. And it's like, creativity is not about efficiency. Art is not about efficiency. That's not its function. And its creativity is the river. It is the creek. And it's just like, whoa, I love that part where it just suddenly like it went down over these rocks, and then there was that waterfall, and it's just coming down, and then there was this place where it went through this like grove of trees, and it was very slow, and it was like, like there's this beauty, it's dynamic, it's fascinating, it's interesting on its path there, right? And that's part of what the flow gives you, as opposed to the plan.
Okay, I got something to say. I know we're about to wrap this baby up, but one thing that just dawned on me was the masculine and feminine energy of art. But it's also interesting because it actually relates to relationships, I think, in a lot of ways. But the thing is so masculine energy, not men or women, but masculine energy is about problem solving, directness. It's about solutions. It's a lot about get the job done. The thing is that when we take that approach with art, we really lose a lot of the flavor and texture and qualities. Creativity does demand feminine energy. And I think that it's something that in our culture, we do struggle with a little bit, because we're a lot about productivity. We're a lot about, let's get it done. Let's figure it out. What's the most efficient, productive way? And the thing is that when you're writing a scene, I can tell you this from a writer's point of view, figure out what the most efficient way to do the scene is, and then put problems in the way. Make it way more difficult to get it done. Like, create an impediment in the character, create a flaw in the character, create a fly in the ointment, create a mistake they make, create a new obstacle, throw a monkey wrench in their plan, like just fucking fuck it right up. Because once you do that, I'm telling you, your writing will be monumentally better. If you are trying to write and you're like, I don't know how to write dialogue, you don't know how to write dialogue, it's impossible to write dialogue for an efficient scene. What are you going to talk about? We did it. It's done. Okay, great. Awesome. Good conversation. No, I can't do it. I'm not going to do it. I fucking hate that fucking person, fuck him, and it's like, you have to do it. It's the job. If we don't, the fucking bomb's going to go off. It's like, I don't fucking care. That guy can fucking die. It's like, all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute. Other people will die if you fucking let your anger come in for this person. All of a sudden you got this relationship dynamic problems. It's emotional. It's not efficient. It's problematic. The feminine energy of creativity is so important, and feminine energy it's much more involved in nuance and things like around the issue. And men and women, like whatever, whatever masculine, feminine relationships will have this problem, because someone will come to someone and go, I had a really tough day. And I have this problem. And the person will go, here's how you solve that problem. And the person goes, yeah, it's not satisfying. What they actually want is they want you to hear their problem. They want you to hear how they feel about it. They want you to hear, this is how it's affecting me. This is like the what it's creating in my life. If you come in and you just go, I'll solve the problem, which might be a part of the conversation, it's often not the point. And in creativity, I don't think we should look at creativity like a problem to solve, but more of an experience to explore. That's my final thought, Evan. I'm going to pass it to you, but first I'm going to say the beer. This, I wanted to get us the weirdest thing I could find, and it's called a Kiwi Pale Ale, and it's Sorio by Moon Underwater. Yeah, interesting. I would say my first sip of it was weird, but as I've had more of it, I've enjoyed it in a funny way. It's definitely a weird beer. It's different than anything I've had, but it's been enjoyable in its own way. It's definitely unique. It stands out. So that's what I got for you.
Yeah, I had a similar experience. It was a little bit first sip or two, I was like, oh, this was not quite what I was expecting it to. I don't know if I really taste kiwi in there. But there's kind of like it does have a tartness to it. I mean, kiwis are quite tart. So I wasn't totally expecting that. But as I've been drinking it, I feel like it's been opening up a little bit. I've been so I've been enjoying it more almost as it goes along. And Moon Underwater. Yeah. I feel like they have another one, like a Gosa or something like that I've had before that I really like. So yeah, no, it's definitely an interesting one and not terrible. Mm-hmm. So, all right. Well, you've made your last comments and, I think the plan is we're going to just jump into another conversation that sort of flows out of a theme or something that's come out of this one. And so maybe I'll leave it somewhat there, but there's something that I feel is like might be the jumping off point. And you're in talking about that sort of that masculine and feminine and what those things do and how they work together. And there's something to me about the feminine potential and the masculine manifestation and how those things work together that I'm really kind of interested in exploring, because yeah, like that sort of, saying like getting the job done and things like that. And it's like, well, that all comes from some place where there's potential, where there's anything can kind of happen. And that's like that feminine space. Right. And so that might be something. I don't know if that's going to be our next thing, but I've been enjoying this conversation that we've had, just talking about that sort of that creative process and flow and all of those things. And I think that just in terms of a takeaway for this one for myself, I'm coming out of it with just like that, yeah, like I'm that going into more of my creative things with like, yeah, look for that thing that has that life of its own, right? Like try and get to that place where the thing starts taking a life of its own. Thank you for listening in on our conversation today. We hope you found something helpful that you can carry forward with you. Head over to our website, wayoftheartist.com, for more free exclusive material and learn about the show. If you haven't already, please support us by subscribing to the show, sharing it with people you know, and keeping compassionate, creative conversation going.